in the cycle of war and revolution that occurred between 1789 and 1989 in Europe, 1848 was by far the most widespread period of revolt that Europe had ever seen. At different points in 1848 and 1849, 57 cities on all nations of the continent except of Russia were taken over by Republican forces, and that includes significant cities like Paris, Berlin, and Rome. All of them were against authoritarian regimes which excluded their publics from participation in the political process. While on the one hand, it was the most widespread revolt, Republican revolt, that Europe has ever seen, it was marked by not having a single success. Not one of them succeeded. By 1852, there was not one republic on the continent of Europe. As the historian Trevelyan, English historian, stated, 1848 is the turning point of history that didn't turn. That said, I think that's sort of a narrow way of looking at the events of 1848, because we should really look at 1848 more as a beginning than as an end. It was the beginning of a period of the public, the masses, and their ideologies taking the political stage in Europe. And it started a dynamic that would play out over a 100-year period. So it's really more enlightening to see what it led to than seeing what it ended, because it didn't end authoritarianism at that point. Now I'll explain this, I know we have very limited time, through basically 3 points, okay? One is the role of non-liberal outlooks in liberal institutions. 2, the concept of revolution from above and not revolution from below during periods of upheaval. And 3, how periods like this of upheaval lead to realigned balances of power. And I'll explain the first 2 points on why the revolutions failed, and the third one will be a short entity in its own. Why did it fail? 2 fundamental reasons, okay? The fury of the public was outstripped the level of the leadership. The leadership was either unwilling or unable to take the public to the areas that it wanted to go to. More fundamentally, this was a period where socialism, more specifically the Marxian variant of socialism, stepped onto the political stage, and with a fighting proletariat in the major cities of Europe. And the socialist demand for radical redistribution of property conflicted with their liberal allies, who were for equal rights, who were for more political participation, but were scared off by the demands for the restrictions on private property and commercialism that were being insisted upon by the socialists. So 1848 marks the beginning of an extremely long-standing split that develops between socialism and liberalism. And by liberalism, I don't mean the liberalism of the Democratic Party. I'm talking liberalism in a more classical sense of freedom of the individual is the highest good, private property is good, commercial development is good, equal rights is good. The socialists saw the liberals as feckless betrayers. Not only that, this didn't only affect the tactics over the next 50 to 70 years and the relationships between the liberals and the socialists, okay? It also affected the way socialists looked at and treated and practiced within liberal democratic institutions. That is to say, over time, parliamentary institutions would develop on the continent. During that time, the socialists would use those institutions to campaign, to advance the cause of their political party, to elect candidates, while at the same time constantly vowing to eventually destroy these institutions. These institutions were tools, they were instruments for advancement of the socialist cause. They were not an end in itself. In other words, we had a major political force, a major political party, okay, with non-liberal goals, operating within liberal democratic institutions, who by the end of the turn of the century were approaching 35 to 40% of the vote of the public. And it was a great concern as to what was going to occur. As these political parties gained more and more power, would they respect the liberal democratic institutions or would they destroy them? And this all leads up to the tremendous split that occurred in 1914 between the socialist parties and the communist parties. It was a pretty even split. If anything, the communist parties had a little bit higher split. Those who wanted to stay on the outside and continue to seek to destroy the liberal institutions while working within them, and those who sought to work within them. Now, what's the relevance for this to what we're talking about now is that it took 50 to 70 years just to get a section, a significant section of political parties, okay, who were not committed to liberalism as their end goal, okay, to be integrated into a liberal democratic framework, okay? And even then, a significant section stayed outside of it, okay, meaning the communist section. And I'm not kidding when I'm saying that's insignificant. It was a significant section that was staying outside of it. Now, just throwing this over into the Arab world, which I know very little about, but enough. We will, if liberal democracy takes hold in some of the countries there, we will have Islamic political parties in a much stronger position starting out than the socialist parties. I don't want to call them illiberal. That would be unfair. But I think if they're Islamic, we could at least call them non-liberal. I think that would be fair. And I think that's one of the questions that we should be talking about, okay? That is to say, what is the prospects that we're facing, okay? If liberal democracy emerges in some of the, and republics emerge in some of these, out of these Arab uprisings, okay? What are the opportunities and dangers in terms of the relationship between these Islamic parties becoming integrated into the liberal democratic framework or undermining them? Turkey certainly provides a potential model, but I would emphasize it's a model, not the model, and it's still, I would say, while doing lots of interesting things, still in a potential stage and not the end. We're not at the end point then. Okay, second reason for the failure. So the first reason for the failure was the split within the revolutionaries themselves. Okay, the split within the liberal camp and the socialist camp. The second reason for the failure, okay, was that the authoritarian regimes, after recovering from the shock of Louis Philippe's fleeing of France, Louis Philippe of France made the president of Tunisia seem like Attila the Hun in terms of he left within 24 hours of the demonstration starting. A revitalized character of authoritarianism developed in Europe. One that emphasized participation, nationalism, and militarism. At the time, it was coined by Karl Marx as Bonapartism, okay, named after Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, because he had become the elected president, popularly elected president, who would then use plebiscites, okay, to close down the legislative assemblies and eventually a plebiscite for having himself elected emperor. So he was a popular authoritarian, and he was popular because he, railed against legislatures and their inabilities to get things done, and B, he sought to bring back to France, okay, the glory of its military grandeur of the past. But the real Bonapartist, okay, of Europe and why the revolutions failed is Otto von Bismarck, okay, Prime Minister of Prussia, who eventually would be Chancellor of the German Empire. Now, I can explain Bismarck's politics basically by two quotes that compares him to the revolutionaries of 1848. I stand for a revolution from above, he said. The revolutionaries of 1848 stood for a revolution from below. That is to say, a revolution from above is where the state transforms society rather than the society transforms the state. Or, he said, the 1848ers talked and demonstrated a lot. We use iron and blood. So, this popular authoritarian, Bismarck, turned upside down a romanticist critique of early 19th century thinking, okay, that argued, the Romanticists argued, that cultures of distinct peoples were being destroyed, okay? They're being destroyed either by an Enlightenment liberalism that emphasized commercialization, okay, and commodified everything and made us more and more homogeneous and broke down distinct national peoples, and the distinct peoples were being destroyed by the internal empires of Europe that still existed out of Austria or the Ottomans, okay? In 1848, Romanticism was a liberation ideology that actually got transferred as a move towards amongst the public into becoming nationalism, okay? What Bismarck did was turn that upside down, okay? He turned that upside down by using Prussia, okay, which was the most powerful principality within a disunited Germany, okay, a fragmented Germany, okay, to use Prussia as a mobilizing center, to unify a splintered Germany and all its principalities, to become the founder of the welfare state, to adapt new technologies for the purpose of mobilizing armies, okay, to the point where Germany, by the time of 1870, was the most effective state apparatus on the domestic and military sphere that had been seen in Europe since, on the continent at least, since the heyday of Napoleon Bonaparte. Last point, this is on 1848 and the years after, and the shift in the balance of power. Some of you may be familiar with something that will be going on this week. Professor David, if you don't know, go talk to Professor David Art right up here. It's called bracketology. Okay? Bracketology is where people try to pick out all the different teams that are playing, okay, in the NCAA tournament and figure out who's going to win. Okay? If you were in 1848 or 1850 or 1852, had bracketology as to who was going to be the leading power in Europe over the next 15, 20 years, no one would have picked Germany. David always likes to pick out the favorite team. Okay? He would have picked Russia. Okay? Russia was by far the most powerful country on the continent at the time. They had penetrated deeply into the Ottoman Empire. They had aided the Austrian Empire, and they stood on the outskirts of Berlin if the Berlin uprising had not been quelled by the authorities there. Okay? In 1852, Louis Napoleon identified Russia as the main enemy, the main disturber of balance of power on the continent. 1852, the British Parliament identified Russia as the main disturber of the balance of power on the continent. Furthermore, the French, in all their wisdom, decided they should now drop their policy of promoting a divided Germany because they needed a unified Germany to act as a buffer against the great threat of Russia. 19 years later, German soldiers are marching in Paris. 19 years later, the British Parliament is declaring Germany the main threat to a balance of power on the continent. What all this means in terms of how the balance of power will change in the Middle East over the next 20 years, I don't know. But if these revolutions are able to not again succeed in the sense of necessarily establishing a republic, but again, bringing the public onto the political stage, I would think that we should start thinking about how that's going to affect the balance of power and how that will change. So in closing, I would say that when I said we should see 1848 more as a beginning than as an end, what can we see? We see A, a new balance of power where Germany is now at the center. B, we see cleavage is developing amongst the electorate where you have a socialist communist divided, making up 40% of the left. You have a very weak center of liberals, and you have a highly organized, mobilizing authoritarianism on the right, okay? And you have a recipe for what's going to occur over the next 100 years, okay? So in that, and as we all know, it's an interesting story. So that's that. Thank you.